Hi everyone. So thanks for joining us today at the Edinburgh DevOps User Group. To mention that today we've got a talk from John Moss from Consensus Limited on understanding cloud infrastructure with Cloudgraph. So Cloudgraph's a GraphQL API that can help you understand what you have deployed in the cloud. And with it, I'll hand over to John just now.
Thank you very much, John. Let me just share the slides. Brilliant. So you should also be seeing hello. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Moss, and as John already introduced me, I'm a senior platform engineer at Consensus Limited. We're a fintech startup in the regulatory space. We aim to deliver open banking APIs around Europe currently. A little about me. I've been working now for Consensus for around 2.5 years. We're a startup, so I basically wear all of the different technical hats, which is challenging, from writing new features to designing the infrastructure and monitoring that powers our SaaS platform. Before I joined Consensus, I was an operations engineer for a company that exclusively ran self-managed data centers around the world, which I think helps give me a bit of an appreciation why it's quite important to be able to keep track of and effectively manage the services that you deploy in your cloud environments. So I'm here to talk to you today about a cool software I've been using at work called Cloudgraph. And I'd like to show you all how it's helped me and my team understand and give insights into what we've actually deployed into our AWS environments. So let's run through the agenda for today's talk. So we'll start with why it is important to understand your cloud environment. We're exploring some of the challenges faced when trying to understand your cloud environment. How Cloudgraph aims to help understand your cloud environments. We'll give a little bit of a primer on GraphQL, as it's the underlying technology that powers Cloudgraph. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the challenges I've found using Cloudgraph. It is an open source tool. It's not you don't get all the bells and whistles. And finally, a demo of Cloudgraph in use, some of the queries that I've found to be quite powerful, and we'll have a little bit of a Q&A after that. So we should start with a little bit of context around Cloudgraph, and which I think will help illustrate why it's important and how it helps. So Cloudgraph is an open source tool made by Autodesk. Autodesk provides kind of the paid for service that Cloudgraph supports. It helps. It scans your multi-environment, multi-cloud data services into a standard type-safe format, which is easy to query, giving you insights you might not have realized about the services you have deployed in your cloud environment. Under the hood, Cloudgraph uses a read-only role to reach out into your different cloud providers, gathering all configuration data for each of your services, processing it, transforming it, and storing the data into a GraphDB software called dgraph. Once that is all finished, you have a single GraphQL endpoint that you can then run any number of complicated GraphQL queries against the stored data. These queries not only allow you to do anything that you would be able to do with, say, the Amazon SDK or CLI, but they allow you to run much more powerful queries where you would realistically have to ingest everything yourself into maybe a large JSON document and then perform some more processing on that. So it really lightens the developer load when trying to find different bits of insights around your cloud infrastructure. It comes shipped with a GraphQL playground. So the moment the scanning is finished, you are able to run any number of queries kind of before having to kind of stage it all in production. So Why is it important that you should understand your cloud environment? So in your day-to-day workflows, it's likely that you've been asked or needed to find out kind of either one of these two questions. The first one, replace EC2 instance with any service in Amazon. How many of them are deployed for a particular service that you're running? So if your account isn't particularly large, if you're running in a single region, if you're kind of just doing things in quite a simple way, you probably could answer question 1 through the console without any real headaches. But the moment you start having tens or hundreds of any kind of service running, or you're running in multi-account, multi-region, you then can't natively find out this information. And even finding out this information via CLI calls, you can't do a CLI call across multiple regions or multiple accounts. Moving on to the second question, easily, without spending days realistically writing out any number of CLI commands or SDK functions to grab every single service and resource that's in one VPC. I wouldn't wish that task on anyone. That doesn't seem like trying to aggregate all that data does not seem like a fun activity. But this is where Cloudgraph excels and hopefully reduces the developer overhead that you might incur from some of the legitimate questions that members of your business may ask you about what you have deployed in your cloud environments. So let's cover a few of the challenges you face when attempting to understand what is deployed in your cloud infrastructure. So, as touched upon in the why, so multiple API requests are realistically required to gather information on any of the services that you have in AWS. So the APIs that Amazon provides are well designed and powerful with what they allow us to create and to see. However, it's a lot of different APIs. The different services in Amazon are generally managed by different technology groups inside Amazon, which seem to always have their slight little flavor of how they want any of the APIs to look like, which is fine. There's always documentation, but that difference and just the sheer number of services that Amazon has and continue to provide to us makes any kind of information gathering across multiple services quite a bit of a task. I think it'd be interesting to see the amount of cumulative time developers have spent flipping through the AWS CLI documentation. I can imagine it's quite a lot. There's very little in the way of CLI tooling by any of the cloud service providers to realistically tackle this problem. Initially, when I first created this presentation, I was doing some research and I found Amazon provides a service called Cloud Control. This looks to try and bridge the gap. However, as with all things, doesn't cover every service, and you still have to know exactly what structure the request to Cloud Control needs to be to provide the information for the particular service. Dynamo would not have the same data shape to gather the data as say something like EC2. So you still need to find the relevant documentation to then maybe make the correct search. If it's not correct, is it going to tell you before it runs? I don't think so. The provided UI by Amazon is also very limited when querying large numbers of services across regions and accounts. For the most part, I like how the AWS UI looks, but it's very pretty. It's not always the most practical user interface. Even something as simple as like an export button for the query that you've searched on would be quite useful. having to contend with pagination. Unless you're running maybe like Firefox with multi-containers, you can't even have 2 instances of different accounts logged in at the same time. It's not easy. So how does Cloudgraph help with this? So first of all, we have automatically generated documentation and query validation. So due to how Cloudgraph is powered by GraphQL, GraphQL being a strictly typed specification on top of REST, it's able to provide a comprehensive and really quite easy to search documentation in the browser playground that appears once you've finished a scan. So even if you're actually unsure on the attributes you would like to query, or even the types of queries that you can run in GraphQL or in the GraphQL schema, you have autocomplete and kind of query validation to ensure that you are doing the right thing. It can be used to scan multiple accounts and multiple regions from a single command. You have to set this up with configuration, but one command allows you to scan every setup account and every configured region that you have services deployed into. So like I said, no more writing scripts against multiple accounts, multiple regions, having to then aggregate all that data. One query is realistically all you need. You are able to scan CIS and PCI policies. CIS is Center for Information Security, and PCI is Payment Card Industry. You may have had interactions with these before, but it's very useful to have these policies able to run as just an extra flag. It will then detail you what's failed, how you need to remediate it, and a bit of information around why it's important. I won't be going into the PCI policies. The queries I have are for CIS when it comes to it. You're able to keep a history of your previous environments. By default, Cloudgraph gives you 10 previous scans. This number can be extended further. I haven't found a limit yet. I presume it will be space on the machine where you're running the scans being the limiting factor. There is a caveat to this. There isn't any way natively in Cloudgraph that allows you to kind of do a comparison between 2 scans. It is obviously is in there paid for, but when a scan is finished, it gives you a large JSON dump of everything that it's found. So I believe with a little bit of work and a little bit of script wizardry, you would be able to compare 2 scans. So if you're going to perform quite a large infrastructure change, you run it before, perform your change, run it after, and at worst, you can visually inspect what has changed. And finally, Cloudgraph supports scanning of multiple cloud environments, not just AWS. From their documentation, you've got Azure, GCP, and even K8s. So if you have multi-tenanted solutions where you're running in Azure and AWS from one query tool, you are able to scan everywhere. The CIS and PCI policies also do apply to these other cloud service providers. I won't be diving into anything for Azure, GCP, or K8s. This is an AWS meetup group, so I don't think that's relevant right now. So what is Cloudgraph? What is GraphQL and how does it help Cloudgraph? So it might be a little bit useful to give a bit of information on GraphQL. It's been around for a while now, close to a decade, but it's not used in many production environments. I think this might be really due to the complexity of the actual server-side implementation of GraphQL. Front-end engineers love GraphQL. It allows you to expose a lot of different parts of your API, and the heavily typed nature of it. It tells you exactly what it needs to be in the query before it runs. However, as with most things, the operations side kind of gets overlooked, and managing a GraphQL server has quite a few caveats. Rate limiting is challenging. Knowing the complexity of queries before running is another challenge. There's a little bit fun. I've got two analogies of what GraphQL is and how it compares to the REST specification. We'll go for the non-technical analogy first. So for GraphQL, sorry, for REST, imagine you go into a McDonald's. If you order something like a Big Mac from the menu, you'd be quite limited on what changes you could make. Probably could swap out gherkins, maybe hold Big Mac sauce if that's not your thing, but you wouldn't be able to just swap out a chicken burger for a Big Mac burger. So that's REST. It's very rigid and limited for the endpoint you are going to call. Whereas if you walked into something like a Subway, you could order any of the breads, any of the fillings, any of the salads. So this is GraphQL. From a single order, you can create kind of any unique sandwich / response that you would like. For the more technical analogy, REST provides a large number of very dumb endpoints, whereas you might be able to add like filtering using request parameters, whereas GraphQL provides a single smart endpoint that when given a particular contract, this contract could have high complexity, then the backend server logic will pass and execute this given contract and return the data that you asked for in the format that you asked for it. So as mentioned, we've got a single entry point into the API that you provided. Kind of a bit of a contrived example. If you have a social media app, you would want a /users endpoint, a /user endpoint, which would take a particular ID, and so on and so forth. So if you wanted to create, say, Cloudgraph in REST, you would realistically need one endpoint for every Amazon service that you need. And well, I'd say you're probably in about as good a position as just calling the CLI at this point. GraphQL helps to reduce under and overfetching. Realistically, a single request is all that's required. You may need to do some post-processing in some edge cases. So GraphQL endpoint allows for very targeted data fetching. So if we think about how Cloudgraph API would work, you can query every single EC2 instance that has been ingested. However, in the body of the payload, you don't need to ask for every single attribute that has been ingested for all of the EC2 instances. You may just want the state of the instance, the type, its security groups. Well, that's all you then ask for, and that's all that is then returned. You don't have to get everything and filter out. Much the same way, you can then filter on related attributes of a query. So if you were to query EC2 instances, you could also put a query on that EC2 instances to, the filter could be based on the security groups associated with the EC2 instances. I have queries and examples in the demo that I'll show how this does work. It's strongly typed. which allows the GraphQL IDEs to provide rich autocomplete. I've touched on this a little bit, but AWS has many different services, and trying to understand and retain all of the attributes for all of these different services is something that, frankly, I don't want to do. I'm quite a lazy engineer. I like everything kind of in front of me or easy to get to, and to reduce the context switching. But the moment you start writing a query, you press a hotkey. For me, it's Control Space on my Mac, and it will then give you autocomplete, which is contextualized for the query you are in. So I would like to talk about some of the difficulties I've found using Cloudgraph. It's, as I said, it's not a fully fledged paid product. It is still in development. So implementing automation in the way I wanted to has been a challenge. At Consensus, we get a half day every other Friday to work on personal development, passion projects, kind of personal enrichment. Or I like to, for me, observability and monitoring are the things I really enjoy at work. So I found Cloudgraph being something that's available, which seemed really interesting to kind of get my hands on. I had some grand pictures of kind of how I wanted it to be deployed. I wanted the dgraph instances in an ECS cluster, a CloudWatch event running every night to make sure Cloudgraph would run and scan and make sure, basically, at the start of every day, you know exactly what is currently in your environment. Then maybe a little Lambda proxy to allow anyone in the business who shouldn't have access to the AWS environments, they can then have a queryable endpoint to stop really asking engineering for some of the questions that they should be able to find out themselves. Unfortunately, I've not been able to do this. Half a day every other week is a little bit it's not really enough time to kind of get that working, but there have been some other problems. The npm module that Cloudgraph provides doesn't easily allow exporting of the different methods for scanning, the policies, launching everything, and the thought of maybe forking it and trying to make something work myself definitely felt like I was going down the wrong path. Their supported deployment mechanisms are also quite limited. You have to it has to be in a Docker container. They do give you the resources to work out how to deploy in other methods, but it's not been the easiest. However, no matter really how I've been maybe misusing their service, every question and every kind of silly question that I've needed to ask them, their Slack channel has been actually pretty amazing. Even when they've turned around and said, you don't use it this way, it's not supported, they've tried to help when I've given them enough logs. Basic GraphQL knowledge is required. Realistically, that amounts to being able to send a request. If you can send a request to a GraphQL endpoint, then you can make this software work. It does get a little bit challenging if you get scanning errors, and the scanning errors could be around kind of GraphQL mutations, at which point I would, unless you are very comfortable using GraphQL, deferring to their Slack support channel for any of the scanning failures. They're generally pretty quick and very good at telling you exactly why it has failed if it's not particularly obvious. As with realistically, anything that has to interact with AWS, not every service is included, due to just how often and how frequently AWS love providing new services for us. And as Cloudgraph is a free software, not every service that you want to deploy into will be covered. Realistically, all of the major ones are, but if you have maybe a bit of a niche need to, I don't know, start a quantum ledger database, you don't expect this to be scanned. However, I'm sure if enough people ask for a particular service to be scanned, they might add it in the near future in further releases. And I did already mention this, scanning errors can be hard to understand and debug, but sending verbose logs on the Slack channel to their team, they've resolved all the issues that I have flagged up to them. So a slide I'm pretty sure everyone's been waiting for is let's have a bit of a demonstration of Cloudgraph. I'll first outline a rough overview of the environment that I've deployed, and then we'll show a configuration file, start a scan. Actually, we'll start a scan first because it does take 5 minutes. No, actually, I won't show a scan just because otherwise we're going to waste 5 minutes of looking at terminal, which we don't need to do that. And then we'll go through some queries to be run, showing off autocomplete and the browser documentation. So a bit of a crude diagram. We've got my MacBook at the bottom, and in my cloud environment, I have 2 accounts and 2 regions. It's deployed with CDK, so they should be identical. I have also made a couple of manual services just so we can see how you could maybe pick them up with Cloudgraph. Let me just move some things around. I think you can all see VS Code. So some light steps to get Cloudgraph installed. It's an npm global package. I've yet to have much luck trying to install it not as a global package and interacting with the methods. We then add the type of policy that we want to add. For me, it's a CIS 1.2. There aren't any other CIS ones that I know, so this probably may increment at some time, but not in the near future. There's an init command, which I won't be running as I already have performed this. This does output the following. It's a simple JSON configuration. You have a section for AWS. I haven't done this, but I would very likely to think that if you initted Azure, you would also get another JSON section labeled Azure. In the init command, you can specify the accounts that you need to query. For the purposes of this demo, I have a AWS credentials file with 2 accounts and the access and security keys kind of specified in there just to make my life easier. Specify the regions you want to query against, the list of resources available. I did just copy. This is what came out from the init command. You may not want to scan every resource. When you do scan, if you have a lot of IAM users and groups and roles, it can take a while to scan just because large environments have quite a lot of them. We specify any policies that we have. So if you wanted PCI as well, you would have another section for PCI. A little bit of storage config, kind of how many versions you want to keep. And the important one to have here is this query engine, so that when you run a scan, there are two query engines that will start, Playground or Altair. I use Playground, but it's in dark mode, and during the setup for this, I think Altair will be better because it's light mode. Or do a bit of a, here's one I did earlier. When you run CG scan, it'll try and find your config, try and find a dgraph host. If a dgraph host is not available, CG scan can be used. As for demo, I've already run this a number of times, and version 1 will be deleted and the new latest version becomes version 10. It verifies that it has access to the roles or ARNs provided. Just lets you know what regions and resources you're configuring to use. And then one by one, it will go through the profile, each of the profiles running the one profile for each region, let you know. I don't have anything in ECS, and I believe this is why it struggles to find information about clusters. The same thing for EFS. As you can see, there's quite a bit. And now it is finished scanning both EU West 1 and EU West 2 for my dev account. And then we have our prod account. Let's see, we'll do the same thing. It'll run the CIS policies and give you a little bit of an overview of what it has found. So my quickly span up demo environments have 11 issues, which isn't great, but it will tell me exactly what it hasn't liked about them. Gives you a bit of an overview on everything that it has scanned. Tells you where it's put, and if I had just run this, this would have then started up. However, I appreciate that this is small. So we have then, you have two options. They both run as they're both available, but whatever one you have in the config is whatever one that will load. However, I like the look of Altair better, and it's Assassin's Creed related, which is always fun. So let's have a look at some of the queries we can run. We'll start with a simpler one. So much the same way that the SDK in Amazon allows you to get information on a single instance given an ID, well, you can use this in the same way. And mentioned before, we have only the attributes that we want for this. However, maybe we want to know the CPU core count as well. And so autocomplete, I didn't need to know that CPU core count was an available attribute. And my tiny little instance has one CPU. Something I do like from Altair over Playground is it gives you some metadata about what it has queried. I'm not a GraphQL expert, so I don't know how useful all of these are, but I can imagine in times where you're running something and it's maybe taking a while, this should give an indication of kind of which one of your queries is taking a while. So let's move on to a slightly more complicated query. So here we want to find, so query every single EC2 instance, and an EC2 instance can have EBS as an attribute, and we want to find every instance where the EBS attribute is not encrypted. Quite good from a security standpoint. And running that, we then are provided a list of everything that we have asked for from EBS, the ID, region, AMI, and also what subnets the instances are deployed into. And so there is a slight issue with Cloudgraph in that, so all of the instances I've deployed for this demo are unencrypted EBS. If I change it to encrypted true, it doesn't disregard anything that doesn't match except for the EBS. So the filter did not match for EBS, but you're still querying every single EC2 instance. Unfortunately, you can't inside this query filter against EBS. However, there are ways around this. Slightly mistake, can we do encrypted? So here we will be querying all EBS instances. I won't try and change demos on the fly. We'll add encrypted anyway. There might be a slightly different way you need to do Boolean filters, but because everything in Cloudgraph, because it's GraphQL and GraphQLs have attributes and kind of related attributes, no, sorry, I slightly lost my train of thought there. But if you want to do this level of nested querying, you have to use the query command for what you want to query. So comparing these two side by side, as well, with GraphQL, you can run multiple queries in the same query field. Gets a little bit confusing. They call these queries. Nice, that is how you do it. So better represents what I was trying to show. So our first query finds any encrypted EBS instances. There are none. However, the second query will return every single EC2 instance. However, the EBS part will be empty unless it is encrypted true. If we have a look at now CIS findings. So here, I've only flagged up failures and for my dev account. And so first of all, I don't have a hardware MFA. Apparently, so I do have a virtual MFA, but it's telling me, well, hardware MFA is better. And that's fine. I haven't found any ways to just exclude particular CIS failures. I guess you can't always have hardware MFA for everything, and you may just say, I don't want, please don't kind of let me know about this, but you don't get that, unfortunately, or at least I've found. And as mentioned earlier, comes with a remediation to clearly explain kind of why, or sorry, how you then can satisfy the CIS finding, giving you information on the different users. And so my administrator account, unfortunately, I did just attach inline policies, which is a CIS medium failure. And pulling back to one of the first questions that we asked in this, they have updated the schema since I last did this presentation and pluralized everything. Give me 2 seconds. As you can see, the contextual hints are quite helpful. It won't, it will let me run it, but it will, much the same way most IDEs will, it will let me know when it thinks something is incorrect. Instances. So this quite large query for the default VPC, which I've now changed, for the non-default VPC, because I'm using a non-default VPC, I want to find not only kind of information about the VPC, but every subnet that's in this VPC, every internet gateway, NACL, route tables, lambdas, everything that there are more things that I can search for, and we can just keep going down. However, I've not deployed all the different types of things, so if I search for Redshift, it would be empty. However, this query then relatively easily will give us all of the information about what subnets are deployed, internet gateways, and you don't just have to settle for ARNs. Any of the use something which actually has information, like a handler for lambdas. Except none of my lambdas are in a VPC. That will not work. It doesn't just have to be ARNs. Anything that you want in here, you can just add with the contextual menus. One final thing, because I think we are coming close up to time, you are able to do FinOps to some degree using Cloudgraph. As long as you have set up the monthly billing rollups, which is a flag that you do need to set per account. You are able to find out, so for this one, for each account, we've got anything that's greater than 0. They are the only attributes, but I can see, well, I've been using Elastic Compute, the costs explorer, which if this is not enabled, you cannot see this information. Well, tax, EC2, everything else I've deployed is kind of on demand. So I've not run the lambdas, so there's no lambda cost. I've not used the Dynamo, so again, no Dynamo cost. Touched on many inquiries. I think another query that's been kind of helpful is finding any CloudWatch logs that have been forgotten to have a retention set, so they will just log forever and eventually start costing us quite a bit of money when they have not been changed. So you can use these queries just to kind of find weaknesses and holes in what you've deployed. And yeah, imagine having to try and find the retention period for every single CloudWatch log that you've got deployed. I don't think that's in the describe CloudWatch events CLI. So you would have to list every single CloudWatch log to get its IDs, and then you would have to create or have to run for that list the describe CloudWatch log endpoint, filter down your list by retention days, and then you have the ID of every CloudWatch log group that has an infinite retention day. And if you just extrapolate that to all the other services that you run, which may have stuff like that, that's a big developer overhead that I don't want to do. And I think that is all.
Cool. Thanks very much for that, John. That was real interesting. Got a few questions here we can just go through, just on some aspects of Cloudgraph and how you've been using it. So, cool. So the first one that came across really just is in terms of the actual update process. Obviously, there was the init process that went through and gathered all the information. But how often is that updated? So say, for example, you launched another EC2 instance. Would that show up in the GraphQL, or would you need to run an update?
You need to run an update every time you want a fresh scan. So yeah, my initial want of at the end of every day, it scans. But if you deployed something in between, it wouldn't appear.
Okay. Okay, and the so the next question I have here is I think you kind of touched on this, but when you do the scan and it's put into a dgraph, are you able to actually have that deployed somewhere so that, like at the moment, everything's done through localhost, but as you mentioned, like having something that you could query would be quite useful. So can you have that in like a Docker container somewhere?
You can. I struggled to get that working, but that's purely a time constraint, not and maybe a knowledge constraint rather than it's not possible. I was having issues with dgraph. It kept just shutting down. But if you can get over that hump, you'll be fine. It is only available in dgraph. You can't use another GraphDB provider, at least yet anyway. But yeah, you can, if you can run the dgraph anywhere and get Cloudgraph ingesting it, I can't see any reason why that wouldn't work.
Okay. I'll just check the. So the next question I have here is just what sort of limitations have you found with the query filters in GraphQL?
So the limitations would be what I touched upon, where if you try to query stuff that doesn't exist, so tagging is probably quite a good example. When if you're, say, querying all of your DynamoDB instances, and then in the tags you want to find only production, every time in that tag attribute it would just be empty if it didn't match. But there is generally always a way around. You then query the attribute rather than querying Dynamo. So you can query tags instead.
Yeah, and get it through that method. Okay. That makes sense. Just check here. And so you've got one more question here. Just in terms of when you were running that, there you had set up the instance profiles for like the AWS side of things. But can you use things like IAM roles to run this? I take it, does it use the actual AWS API underneath?
I don't know what it uses underneath, but yes, you can use IAM roles. So when I initially was getting this working for a work setting, I would, on my local machine, assume role first, and then have the name of the role in the configuration. So instead of it just being the name, it was the name of the account. For the credentials file, it was the name of the role. And when, for the part I did get working in Amazon, when I set up an ECS profile and I gave the execution profile a read role to every service and span up the Cloudgraph. I ran Cloudgraph in that. It was able to pick up that role. I believe as well, but I haven't tried it. You are able to do cross-account access, which I think from the configuration file, that's where the external ID comes in. But I've not had to try that yet.
Right. So it'd be like a trust relationship, essentially, probably is how it would work. Yeah. Because the external ID part is used in that trust relationship, so I imagine it will be the same. Let me just have a let's see if we've got anything. So obviously when you were doing the demo there, you did have multiple accounts. So was that just you had multiple profiles, or did your profile have access to both accounts?
So I used organization. I used an organization, and but yeah, it was kind of definitely not the right way you should do it, but it was in the credentials file. I've got a section for the Cloudgraph demo dev and Cloudgraph demo prod, which just have the access and secret key hard coded
For each one, yeah. Cool.
Yeah, but I would expect that the cross-account access using the external ID should be possible. As well, if you get stuck, their Slack channel they're on it. I think they're based in America, so you've got a little bit of a wait. But when they're around, they go above and beyond. For something that's free, I'm quite impressed.
Yeah. Cool. That sounds really good. It does look like a really interesting product. I don't know how many times I've written things against the API to try and like for things like whenever there's a new release comes out, or even things like for Lambda functions, how many of them are using Python 2 when you have to upgrade them, or how many RDSs are using an older version of MySQL and need upgraded. Just trying to find that information takes a while through the API, so something like this looks like it could be really interesting.
Yeah, if you could, if the automation can get working, and then because you can then just give it to engineers that don't have the level of knowledge but still kind of need to be a bit technical to understand that. Ideally, you can then have just a front end which, like, just in a nice tabular way, can let anyone see what they want to see, like your business admins guys, anyone. Have a look.
Exactly. With just a comment in there as well, it'd be very handy for audit situations, which is very true. even just things like knowing how many EC2 instances do I have across the world, because you never know if that's one of the common attacks. If someone gets access to your account, spin up an EC2 instance like a Bitcoin miner in a region that you don't normally use, so you never see it until you get the bill on. So that'd be quite good. So yeah, I think that's us at time just now. I don't get any other questions at the moment, so just wanted to say thanks very much for the presentation. It was really interesting.
You're very
And
welcome.
thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Bye bye.
Cheers.